The 10th studio album from the experimental psychedelic pop group Animal Collective is business as usual for the trio. Present are the eclectic sounds, glitchy electronic, warbled and with plenty of interesting moments. Whenever dealing with music of a psychedelic nature or indeed an experimental nature, there are going to be moments here and there that will sour the palate, especially if you're not a massive fan of this particular style of music. And whilst I wouldn't classify myself as a big fan of either, that doesn't necessarily mean that I can't enjoy music of this variety. I do find the majority of the sounds on this album very plentiful, lively and with plenty of character and interesting moments. That's one thing you find with this album. Very rare is there a dull moment to be found. The glitchy, computeresque noises, buzzes and squeaks of the electronic instrumentation is enjoyable. Yeah, I can't help but feel disconnected from this album, largely in part due to the vocal deliveries. Whilst they are very kooky, off the wall and provide for an intriguing listen, the overall presentation doesn't give me much room to embrace this album fully. For the large part, the delivery is very staccato, sounding like one person delivers a word, then someone else delivers a word, followed by another, and then another, and then another, which is inventive, but over the course of a 40-minute album, it can drain on the listener's patience, as on repeated listen, the overall enjoyment diminishes. If obnoxious was this group's intention, then they succeeded in doing so. Whilst Floridada definitely has a catchy hook and instrumentally, it's one of the very few highlights of the album, deprive the listener of reading the lyrics, you're struggling to really gauge what's being sung. The bouncy production, layered vocal effects, liveliness and strong hook can only take you so far before you abandon any hope of actually understanding the sinner. The next track, Hocus Pocus, is much more restrained in comparison, the kick drum being the driving force behind the track and the glitch elements being much more contained. And whilst the vocal delivery may be clearer, the clarity is missing in a large chunk of the track. With the next two tracks suffering from the same issue, it does feel like you're in for the long haul. But then the track The Burglars appears and there is a glimmer of hope. The running theme of disjointed vocal delivery is dropped for a faster delivery, which is probably the only source of variety we get in terms of vocals, and whilst they are rushed and clarity still remains an issue, I do find some appeal in the song, even if it's not necessarily one of my favourites. Out of all the tracks available, the two where I find the most appeal would be in the tracks Bagels in Kiev and Golden Gal. The first having a quirky little dance beat, constant synth bass line, lingering synth lines and warbled effects that don't feel overly produced, obnoxious or overstay their welcome. And the second track, which references the popular 80s sitcom Golden Girls, the vocals are at their most clear and decipherable, and despite the simple deep bass line and simple drum beats and effects, it's easily the best track on the album, and it only frustrates me that it took 11 tracks before I came across a track that I could fully embrace without having much in the way of criticisms. And I'm also willing to give Natural Selection a pass as well as in terms of its production. Danceable, bouncy bassline, glitchy and warbled effects, much like a lot of these album's tracks, but it doesn't force the vocals in the background to the point where they're unbearable. There are other examples of good moments, the song Spilling Guts opening up with a strong punchy drum and bass groove, but at barely 2 minutes long, I feel that it's a track that needed extending, and there are certainly tracks here that could have been shortened as a result. Lying on the Grass could have been saved if the vocals weren't as bad as they were, probably the most unbearable out of all the songs, and On Delay comes close to being the worst track with its looped beat and lack of real imagination. If I were to choose a track that encompassed everything that I don't like about the album, I'd say that they would all be found in the last track, Recycling. It's without a doubt the best example of the group just throwing all the magnets onto the fridge, seeing what sticks and just going with it. Not only that, but the lyrics themselves don't really leave much to the imagination, and the lack of clear narrative does come off as slightly pretentious and self-indulgent. There's no real narrative, no running theme and nothing that's clear cut. It's just stringing along sentences and hoping that no one will give them the time of day. For a psychedelic pop album, there are plenty of moments where there's a good foundation for a good album, but the repetitive nature, the lack of a clear direction lyrically, the annoying vocal deliveries, the inconsistencies, it's an album that despite the 40-minute running time, it feels longer and does feel rather fruitless and skippable for the most part. Overall, I score this album a 58 out of 100.